What if I told you that every dollar in your wallet right now is worth exactly nothing? Not metaphorically, not eventually, right now. Because on August 15th, 1971, President Richard Nixon walked into the Oval Office and did something unprecedented in human history. He severed the final link between the US dollar and gold. He didn't ask Congress. He didn't hold a referendum. He went on national television for 9 minutes and permanently changed the rules of money for every person on Earth. And here's the part they don't want you to know. It wasn't about saving the economy. It was about building an empire. You feel it every day. Your paycheck buys less. Your rent climbs faster than your raises. You work harder but fall further behind. That's not an accident. That's not inflation. That's the direct engineered consequence of what happened in 1971 when America abandoned real money and replaced it with something far more profitable. A global debt trap backed by oil, military force, and the illusion of stability. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented financial history that's been sanitized, repackaged, and sold to you as progress. So before we go deeper, drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Because this story affects every corner of the planet, and I want to know who's finally ready to hear the unfiltered truth. Hit that subscribe button if you're tired of the sanitized version of economics they taught you in school. Let's talk about the day money died, and what replaced it. Let's rewind. After World War II, the global economy was in ruins. Europe was rubble. Asia was devastated, and the United States, untouched and holding over 70% of the world's gold reserves. So in 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and designed a new financial order, the Bretton Woods Agreement. Here's how it worked. The US dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. If you held dollars, you could theoretically walk into the US Treasury and exchange them for physical gold. This made the dollar as good as gold, the global reserve currency, the anchor, the safe haven. But there was a catch. The US had to maintain enough gold to back the dollars in circulation. It was a constraint, a discipline, a limit on how much money could be created out of thin air. Sound familiar? It should. Because today, there are zero constraints. The Federal Reserve creates trillions at the stroke of a keyboard, and there's no gold requirement, no commodity backing, nothing but faith and the threat of consequences for those who refuse to accept it. Now here's where the cracks started to show. The 1960s. The Vietnam War was a financial black hole. President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were expensive. The U.S. was spending far more than it was earning, printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. Foreign governments started to notice. France, in particular, under President Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold for their dollars. In 1965, France converted $150 million into gold. By 1971, the U.S. gold reserves had fallen from 20,000 tons to just 8,100 tons. Sound familiar? Governments today are once again stockpiling gold. China, Russia, India, all reducing their dollar reserves and buying physical gold in record amounts. They've seen this movie before. By the summer of 1971, the situation was critical. Foreign central banks held $80 billion in claims against U.S. gold reserves worth only $10 billion. It was a run on the bank, except the bank was the United States of America. Nixon had two choices: default on the gold promise and admit the dollar was overvalued, or change the rules entirely. He chose option two. On August 15th, 1971, Nixon announced he was temporarily closing the gold window. Foreign governments could no longer redeem dollars for gold. The dollar would float freely. It was sold as a temporary emergency measure to stabilize the economy. That temporary measure is now in its 54th year. Sound familiar? Every emergency power in modern finance starts as temporary. Quantitative easing after 2008? Temporary. Zero interest rates? Temporary. COVID stimulus? Temporary. They never end. They just get renamed and normalized. But here's what they didn't tell you on that August night. Nixon didn't just end the gold standard. He ended the last restraint on U.S. monetary expansion. He ended the accountability of the U.S. government to the rest of the world. And most importantly, he opened the door to a new system. A system where the U.S. could export inflation, import goods, and never have to pay the bill. Because the dollar was now a pure fiat currency. Faith-based money. And that faith would need to be enforced. Within 2 years, the U.S. made a secret deal that would lock in dollar dominance for the next 5 decades, and counting. A deal with one of the most powerful cartels in history. A deal that would turn black gold into the foundation of green paper. A deal that would quietly replace the gold standard with something far more insidious. And that deal has a name. Enter the petrodollar system. In 1973, the world faced an oil crisis. OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, had weaponized oil exports, slashing production and quadrupling prices in retaliation for U.S. support of Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Gas lines stretched for miles. Inflation spiked to double digits. The American economy teetered on the edge of collapse. But behind closed doors, U.S. Treasury officials, led by Secretary William Simon, were negotiating a deal that would change everything. The terms were simple and ruthless. Saudi Arabia would sell oil exclusively in U.S. dollars, no exceptions. Every country that wanted oil, the lifeblood of industrial civilization, would first have to obtain dollars. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection, weapons, and a guarantee of the Saudi regime's survival. By 1974, the deal was done. Quietly, no congressional vote, no public debate. Just a secret agreement that would prop up dollar demand for generations. But here's the part that should make your blood run cold. This wasn't just about oil. This was about creating artificial demand for U.S. currency on a global scale. Think about it. Every nation on Earth needs energy. So every nation on Earth now needed dollars. Not because the dollar was backed by gold, not because the U.S. economy was the most productive, but because oil was only sold in dollars. Sound familiar? Today, the U.S. sanctions countries by cutting them off from the dollar-based financial system. SWIFT, international banking, trade, Russia, Iran, Venezuela. It's not about justice, it's about control. If you don't play by dollar rules, you don't get to play at all. And the Saudis? They took those oil revenues, hundreds of billions of dollars, and recycled them back into U.S. Treasury bonds, funding the U.S. deficit and keeping interest rates artificially low. This is what economists politely call the petrodollar recycling system. What they don't call it is what it actually is, a wealth extraction scheme with a military guarantee. But the true scale of this system, the mechanics of how it vacuums wealth from every corner of the planet and funnels it into Wall Street and Washington, that's where it gets truly sinister. You won't believe the numbers. And the receipt is wilder than you think. Let's break down exactly how the petrodollar empire works, because this is where the illusion of modern finance is most transparent and most predatory. Step 1, global dollar dependency. After 1974, every country that wanted oil had to first acquire U.S. dollars. To get dollars, they had to either export goods to the U.S., borrow dollars from international banks, or attract dollar-denominated investment. This created permanent structural demand for dollars, regardless of the health of the U.S. economy. Here's the number that matters. By 1980, the global oil trade was worth approximately $500 billion annually, all denominated in dollars. By 2008, it reached $3.3 trillion. Today, even with increased energy diversity, oil markets still transact over $2 trillion annually in dollars. That's $2 trillion in forced demand for U.S. currency every single year just to purchase energy. Step 2, the export of inflation. Now here's where it gets diabolical. When the Federal Reserve prints money, quantitative easing, stimulus packages, bank bailouts, that newly created money doesn't just stay in America. It floods global markets because the world needs dollars for trade. So when the Fed printed $4.5 trillion between 2008 and 2014 after the financial crisis, that inflation was exported globally. Developing nations saw their currencies devalue against the dollar. Import prices spiked. Their citizens got poor while America imported cheap goods paid for with freshly printed paper. And when the Fed printed another $4.8 trillion during COVID between 2020 and 2022, same outcome. U.S. consumers experienced inflation, yes, but the real devastation hit emerging markets. Sri Lanka collapsed. Pakistan's economy cratered. Lebanon's currency lost 95% of its value against the dollar. This is the hidden tax of dollar hegemony. The U.S. prints and the world pays. Step 3, the debt trap. But the system gets even more parasitic. Developing nations that need dollars to buy oil often can't earn enough through exports. So they borrow dollars from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, or Western commercial banks. Those loans come with strings attached: structural adjustment programs, austerity measures, privatization of public assets, removal of capital controls. In other words, we'll lend you dollars, but you have to restructure your economy to benefit foreign investors and creditors. And here's the kicker. Those loans are denominated in dollars. So if the dollar strengthens, which it tends to do during global crises, the debt burden becomes heavier in local currency terms, even if the principal stays the same. Between 1970 and 2020, total external debt of developing countries exploded from $70 billion to over $8.7 trillion. That's a 12,000% increase, and much of it denominated in dollars, payable in dollars, dependent on access to dollars. This is financial imperialism with a spreadsheet. Step 4, petrodollar recycling and Wall Street. Now let's follow the money. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC nations accumulate massive dollar surpluses from oil sales. What do they do with those dollars? They can't just sit on cash. It would lose value to inflation. So they invest it back into dollar-denominated assets: U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. stocks, U.S. real estate, weapons contracts from U.S. defense contractors. By 1977, Saudi Arabia held an estimated $20 billion in U.S. securities. By 2016, that number had reached $117 billion in Treasury holdings alone. And that's just what's officially reported. Estimates suggest the Saudis hold upwards of $800 billion in total U.S. assets when you include private investments, real estate, and corporate holdings. This recycling mechanism serves two purposes. First, it funds the U.S. deficit, allowing America to run up enormous debts without facing a bond market crisis. Second, it keeps interest rates lower than they would otherwise be, making borrowing cheaper for the U.S. government and American consumers. In essence, oil producers are subsidizing American consumption with their own revenues, and if they ever tried to stop, the implicit threat is clear: we withdraw military protection, and your regime faces domestic unrest or foreign invasion. Step 5. The SWIFT weapon. Now we arrive at the enforcement mechanism, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT. It's the messaging system that enables banks globally to send payment instructions to one another, and guess what currency dominates SWIFT transactions? As of 2023, 88% of all international transactions settled through SWIFT are denominated in US dollars. When the US wants to punish a country, it doesn't invade. Not anymore. It cuts them off from SWIFT. Russia in 2022, Iran in 2018, North Korea. Suddenly, those nations can't conduct international trade. Their banks can't communicate with foreign banks. Their economies are strangled without a single bomb being dropped. This is the modern face of dollar dominance. Financial exclusion as a weapon of war. Step 6. The illusion of stability. Here's the propaganda you've been fed. The dollar is the global reserve currency because the U.S. economy is strong, stable, and trustworthy. That's the story. Here's the reality. The dollar is the global reserve currency because oil is priced in dollars, because the U.S. military enforces that pricing, and because any country that tries to exit the system faces sanctions, coups, or invasion. Let's talk about the countries that tried to escape the petrodollar. Iraq. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced that Iraq would begin selling oil in euros instead of dollars. By 2003, the U.S. invaded under the pretense of weapons of mass destruction, none of which were ever found. By 2004, Iraqi oil sales were back in dollars. Libya. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi began advocating for a pan-African currency backed by gold, the gold dinar, to replace the dollar in African oil trade. By 2011, NATO forces, led by the US and France, bombed Libya into regime change. Gaddafi was killed. The gold dinar was never mentioned again. Libyan oil? Back to dollars. Iran. For years, Iran has attempted to sell oil in currencies other than the dollar. Euros, yuan, even gold. The result? The most comprehensive sanctions regime in modern history. Iran's economy has been crippled, its currency devalued by over 600% against the dollar since 2018, and its people have suffered under economic warfare, not because of nuclear weapons, but because they dared to bypass the dollar. Coincidence? Or enforcement of the most profitable protection racket in history? Step 7. The moral hazard of infinite money. Here's the final piece of the puzzle. When you control the global reserve currency and you're no longer constrained by gold, you can print unlimited money to solve domestic problems. Bank collapses in 2008, print $700 billion for bailouts. Pandemic in 2020, print $5 trillion. Inflation rising in 2021, deny it for a year, then raise interest rates and export the pain to foreign debt holders. The United States has run a trade deficit every single year since 1975, 49 consecutive years. That means America has imported more than it's exported for half a century. Under a gold standard, this would be impossible. You'd run out of gold, the deficit would self-correct. But under a Fiat Petrodollar system, you just print more dollars, you export inflation, you issue more debt, and the world has no choice but to accept it, because they need dollars to buy oil. As of 2024, U.S. national debt stands at over $34 trillion. That's 123% of GDP. Under normal circumstances, that would trigger a currency crisis, skyrocketing interest rates, and economic collapse. But because the dollar is the reserve currency, because global trade is trapped in the petrodollar system, the U.S. can continue to borrow and print with relative impunity. This is the illusion of stability. The system hasn't collapsed yet, so we assume it never will. But history tells a different story. Every empire that debased its currency eventually faced a reckoning. Rome, Spain, Britain. The only question is timing. And when it comes, it won't be slow. It'll be sudden, catastrophic, and global. Because unlike past empires, the dollar isn't just one nation's currency. It's the operating system of the entire global economy. So where does that leave us in 2024? We're living in the endgame of a 53-year experiment in infinite money creation, and the cracks are getting harder to ignore. China and Russia are settling trade in yuan and rubles. Saudi Arabia is now accepting yuan for oil sales to China, the first major breach of the Petrodollar agreement in 50 years. Central banks globally are buying gold at the fastest pace since 1950. The BRICS nations are openly discussing alternatives to the dollar-dominated financial system. The empire is not eternal, it's just well-armed and well-marketed. And here's the terrifying part. When the petrodollar system finally breaks, and it will break, the fallout will be exponentially worse than 1971. Because in 1971, the global economy was far less interconnected, far less financialized, and far less dependent on debt. Today, global debt stands at $307 trillion, 356% of global GDP. Derivatives markets exceed $600 trillion in notional value. The entire system is built on borrowed time, borrowed money, and the borrowed legitimacy of a currency backed by nothing but military threat and historical inertia. The lesson here isn't about gold bugs or crypto enthusiasts. It's about denial. It's about a civilization that replaced honest accounting with infinite credit and called it progress. It's about trusting institutions that have repeatedly proven they will change the rules the moment those rules become inconvenient. In 1971, they told you it was temporary. In 2008, they told you the banks were too big to fail. In 2020, they told you the money printing wouldn't cause inflation. They were wrong every time, and they're wrong now. So here's my final question for you. Are we wiser now, or are we just walking the same path in better suits? Drop your thoughts below. Share this with someone who still thinks the dollar is backed by something real. And if you want more unfiltered economic history they don't teach in schools, hit that subscribe button. Because the truth isn't a conspiracy, it's just inconvenient.